On September 23, 1941, in Kronstadt Harbor, located at the Gulf of Finland, a 23,000-ton Soviet battleship sits in port. It has been there for a week, undergoing repairs, surrounded by one of the most heavily armed positions in the entire Soviet Union. Over 1,000 anti-aircraft guns, shipboard and on shore, protect this harbor. The Germans have already tried to get to it once. It didn't work. Now a single Stuka dive bomber is pointing its nose straight down at her deck. The pilot has already been told the shrapnel from his own bomb will reach 3,000 feet into the air on impact. He releases it at 900 feet. He has done the math. He drops it anyway. The bomb punches through the deck. It finds the forward ammunition magazine. What happens next is not an explosion. It's an erasure. A column of fire and smoke climbs 1,200 feet into the air. The forward section of the ship disintegrates. 326 men are killed in seconds. The Marat, a 600-foot Russian dreadnought that had been shelling German ground troops from 18 miles away, breaks apart and settles to the bottom of the harbor. The pilot pulls out at roughly 10 feet above the water. His wheels are almost skimming the surface. He momentarily blacks out from the force of the pull. His rear gunner's voice comes through the headset. "She is blowing up, sir." His name is Hans-Ulrich Rudel. He is 25 years old. 3 years earlier, the German Luftwaffe had officially declared him unsuitable for combat flying. There are a few records in World War II that are so far outside anything else that they seem like they were invented. Erich Hartmann shot down 352 aircraft, a number so extreme that Allied intelligence initially refused to believe it was one man. Audie Murphy fought off an entire German tank assault alone on top of a burning vehicle. Those stories are real. They have their place. But Hans-Ulrich Rudel sits in a different category altogether, because Rudel wasn't just exceptional at what he did. He was exceptional at something almost no one else was doing at all. Systematically destroying armored vehicles from the air, one at a time, at close range, in a slow aircraft, over the most brutal front in military history. By the time the war ended, the official Luftwaffe record credited him with 519 tanks, a battleship, a cruiser, 70 landing craft, over 800 other vehicles, 150 artillery positions, and 2,530 total combat missions. A number that no pilot from any nation in any war has come close to since. Stalin reportedly put a 100,000 ruble bounty on his head personally. A German field general said Rudel alone was worth an entire division. Germany ran out of medals for him and had to create a new one that was never given to anyone else, before or since. This is the story of where that man came from. And the first thing you need to understand is that nothing about his beginning suggested any of it was coming. Konrad Swaldow, Lower Silesia, July 2nd, 1916. The village is small, agricultural, set in the rolling landscape of what is today southwestern Poland. It was then part of the Prussian province of Silesia in the German Empire, and it was the kind of place where the biggest institution in town was the local church. That church was run by Johannes Rudel, a Lutheran minister. His wife was Martha. They had 2 older daughters, Ingeborg and Johanna. On July 2nd, their 3rd child arrived, a boy. They named him Hans-Ulrich. He weighed less than 6 pounds at birth. That detail sounds like it belongs in the opening of a different story, a gentler one, about a frail child who grew up to become something surprising. In this case, it's exactly that story, except the ending is unlike anything you'd expect. As a boy, Rudel was unremarkable in the classroom. The gymnasium he attended in the nearby town of Lobing, a humanities-oriented secondary school, didn't particularly suit him. He wasn't interested in books. He was interested in the outdoors, in the mountains, in physical limits. He taught himself to ski at 10 years old. He threw himself at every sport available to him, and he was good at all of them. Good enough that within the Hitler Youth, which he joined in 1933 at 17, he became a champion decathlete, one of the best young multi-event athletes in the country. An Olympic future was considered realistic, but there was something else driving this, something more personal. By the accounts of people who knew him as a child, Rudel was genuinely timid as a boy, shy to the point where it held him back. It was his older sisters, Ingeborg and Johanna, who broke through that, not with encouragement, but with mockery. They teased him, and something in that reaction, that refusal to be seen as small, lit a fire in him that apparently never went out. He wrote later that once he had conquered that fear, no tree was too high, no slope too steep, no brook too wide. He developed a personal motto that he kept for the rest of his life. Only he who gives up on himself is lost. That line is worth remembering, because it becomes the only real explanation for what comes later. His father couldn't afford civilian pilot training. The family money had gone toward his older sister's medical studies, and pilot school wasn't cheap. But then in 1936, the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring's newly expanded German Air Force, began offering officer cadetships. Rudel applied. He was accepted. Basic training began at the School of Air Warfare at Wildpark Werder that same year. He wanted to be a fighter pilot. Almost all of them did. In June 1938, he was assigned to Sturzkampfgeschwader 168 in Graz, a Stuka dive bombing unit. This was not the assignment he wanted, but it was the one he had. He threw himself at the training, and here, for the first time, something simply didn't work. The precision attack techniques, the steep angled dives, the controlled release, the pull-out timing. Rudel couldn't master them. The rest of his unit was already fully trained and operational. He was falling behind. His instructors ran out of patience. On January 1st, 1939, Rudel was formally transferred out of the dive bombing unit. The paperwork described him as unsuitable for combat flying. He was sent to the reconnaissance flying school at Hildesheim instead, to train as an observer, essentially a passenger with a camera. He sat in the back of the aircraft looking at what was below and writing it down. He would not be the one dropping the bombs. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. The war began. Rudel flew reconnaissance missions over Poland from Breslau, cataloging Soviet positions and infrastructure for headquarters. He earned the Iron Cross Second Class on October 11, 1939, a routine early war decoration that meant, essentially, that he had flown missions in a combat zone without being killed. He was 23 years old, watching a war happen around him from the observer's seat of a reconnaissance aircraft. He immediately began filing requests to be reassigned to dive bombing. They were rejected. He filed more, rejected again. This went on for months. The war in the West began in 1940. France fell, the Battle of Britain unfolded, and Rudel spent that period as a regimental adjutant for a training unit in Vienna, doing administrative work, far from anything. Not quite a combat pilot, not quite anything. The military version of being told to wait in the corridor while everyone else is in the room. He kept filing the requests. Finally, in May 1940, the Luftwaffe relented. Rudel was admitted to dive bomber training. Again. And again, he struggled. His reputation preceded him everywhere he went. The poor pilot. The one who couldn't get it the first time. The man who had been declared unsuitable. He was sent to a reserve flight at Graz for additional training. He spent the invasion of Crete in a non-combat role. He was there, but not there. Present, but kept back. What kept him going during all of this, nobody can say for certain, but the motto was consistent. The requests didn't stop. He didn't stop. In early 1941, Germany began moving forces east. The plan, Operation Barbarossa, called for the invasion of the Soviet Union in June. Rudel's unit, Sturzkampfgeschwader II, the Immelmann Wing, named after the World War I German ace, was transferred to occupied Poland in preparation. By the time the invasion began, Rudel had finally completed his Stuka training. He was in the unit. He was going east. June 23, 1941. Radzki, northeastern Poland. The invasion had begun the day before. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Rudel took off on his first combat dive bombing mission. He flew over the Grodno area of what is now western Belarus, part of the massive opening wave of Barbarossa. He kept flying. By 10 o'clock that night, he was still in the air. Multiple missions in a single day, back to back. Mission after mission, hour after hour across the chaos of a front that stretched for nearly 2,000 miles. His commanding officer, Hauptmann Ernst Siegfried Stein, noticed something about this new pilot early on. Rudel flew dangerously low on his attack runs, closer to the target than doctrine recommended, closer than most pilots were comfortable with. The reason was accuracy. He wanted to be certain of the hit. Stein, who would become something of a mentor in these early months, called him a crazy fellow. He meant it as a compliment. On July 18, 1941, less than a month into his first real combat deployment, Rudel was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. He had gone from the man nobody wanted, the pilot declared unsuitable, the officer filing rejected transfer requests in Vienna, to a decorated combat aviator in a matter of weeks. But that wasn't the moment things changed. The moment things actually changed came 2 months later, in September 1941, on the shores of the Gulf of Finland. The Soviet Baltic Fleet had a problem for the Germans besieging Leningrad. The fleet was based out of Kronstadt, an island fortress 12.5 miles from the Leningrad harbor. The battleships, cruisers, and destroyers moored there were firing their guns directly onto German ground forces. 12-inch shells, 1,000 pounds each, reaching 18 miles inland. The German army was advancing on foot. The fleet was parked offshore and shooting them from a distance they couldn't respond to. Something had to be done about it. On September 16, 1941, the whole Stuka wing was ordered to attack. 30 aircraft went out in the foulest weather. Low cloud, poor visibility, anti-aircraft fire that witnesses described as bursting like the clap of doomsday. Rudel followed Stein into the dive. Stein's bomb missed. Rudel's 1,000-pound bomb hit the Marat's aft deck and exploded. The ship caught fire. A fire chased Rudel's Stuka back into the cloud cover. Then the reconnaissance report came back. The Marat had survived. She was in Kronstadt harbor, now undergoing repairs, still afloat, still a threat. New 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs had just arrived at the airfield. Rudel requested to go back. Kronstadt harbor was one of the most heavily defended positions the Soviets had. Every gun in the harbor would be aimed at anything that approached from the air. The odds against any single pilot getting through that volume of fire, finding the target, and landing a hit were long. The odds of surviving the pullout from a dive, while inside the bomb's own fragmentation radius, were longer still. Rudel went anyway, September 23, 1941. The Stuka formation entered the harbor. The flak was so intense and so accurate that the formation immediately broke apart. Each pilot on his own now, bobbing, weaving, trying to stay alive long enough to reach the target. Rudel tucked in behind Stein. He could see the Marat below, large and close, sailors running across the deck. He lined up the dive. He released the bomb at 900 feet. The safe release. Altitude was 3,000 feet. He knew that. He released it anyway. The pull-out G-force knocked him unconscious for a moment. He came back to the sound of Alfred Charnovsky's voice in the headset. His rear gunner, a young East Prussian, the 13th child in his family, a man Rudel described as someone who nothing could ruffle. "She is blowing up, sir." Behind them, a 1,200-foot column of fire was rising from the harbor. The bomb had gone through the deck and found the forward ammunition magazine. The detonation cracked the hull. The battleship's bow section was destroyed. The Marat settled to the bottom of Kronstadt harbor in 11 meters of water, killing 326 of her crew. She would never go to sea again. Rudel's wheels skimmed the surface of the Gulf of Finland on the way out. He had cleared the water by roughly 10 feet. The man declared unsuitable for combat flying 3 years earlier had just destroyed a 23,000-ton Soviet battleship with a 2-man aircraft with a single bomb in a harbor defended by over 1,000 guns. In October 1941, he was awarded the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet for special achievement in the air war. By December of that year, he had flown his 400th mission. In January 1942, he received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. He hadn't even started yet. The battleship was a milestone, A single extraordinary moment that got him noticed, got him decorated, proved what he could do. But what came after it? The 4 more years of war, the escalating destruction, the wounds, the crash landings, the 2,000 plus more missions, the 519 tanks, that had nothing to do with a single good day. That had to do with who Rudel actually was. And who he was someone who simply would not stop. The war on the Eastern Front was about to enter its worst years. The German advance had stalled. The Soviet Union wasn't collapsing the way the planners in Berlin had assumed it would. The battles ahead, Stalingrad, Kursk, the long retreat, would be unlike anything the war had produced so far. Millions of men would die in conditions of cold and exhaustion and industrial slaughter on a scale that still defies easy comprehension. Rudel flew into all of it, every day, more missions than any pilot in history. Not because he had to, because he refused to stop. What happened on those missions, what he built, destroyed, survived, and eventually lost, is where this story really begins. By January 1942, Hans-Ulrich Rudel had flown 500 combat missions. Stop and think about that number for a second. American bomber pilots flying over Europe were typically rotated home after 25 missions, if they survived that long. The statistical odds of completing 25 missions over Nazi-occupied Europe without being killed were grim enough that some crews started writing letters home after Mission 10. The 8th Air Force considered 25 a full tour. After that, you went home. Rudel had flown 500, and he was barely getting started. The Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942 was a different kind of war from anything happening in the West. It was larger, colder, more brutal, and fought with a ferocity that the Western campaigns simply didn't match. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, opened a front nearly 2,000 miles long. More than 3 million Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory on day one. By the first winter, both sides were absorbing casualties that would have ended wars elsewhere. The Soviet Union alone would eventually lose somewhere between 26 and 27 million people before it was over. Rudel flew above all of it, every day, multiple times a day, targets, pullouts, landings, refueling, back in the air. That's the part that doesn't get captured in the numbers alone. It wasn't just that he flew a lot of missions. It was that he flew them constantly, without breaks, on an active front where the life expectancy of a Stuka pilot in a contested area could be measured in weeks. The Ju-87 was already considered outdated by the time Barbarossa began. It was slow. The B model topped out at around 200 miles per hour, which meant Soviet fighter pilots, if they could reach it, had no trouble catching it. The Stuka's famous screaming siren, which had terrified infantry across Poland, France, and Greece, meant almost nothing to experienced Soviet troops who'd learned to distinguish the sound, find cover, and return fire. None of that slowed Rudel down. If anything, it seemed to have the opposite effect. After the Murat attack in September 1941, the Immelmann wing moved south to the Rzhev sector for the first Russian winter. It was brutal. The supply lines were stretched thin, petrol froze. The cold reached temperatures the Germans hadn't equipped for, and fresh Soviet divisions, some of them transferred from Siberia, acclimatized to the cold in ways the German soldiers simply weren't, launched assault after assault on the German positions. The Stukas defended their own airfield from ground attacks on more than one occasion that winter. Rudel flew in it all. By January 1942, with 500 missions logged, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's most recognizable combat decoration at the time, the one that fighter aces and tank commanders had been receiving since the opening of the war. Rudel received it not for aerial combat, not for dogfights or kill counts, but for sustained excellence in close air support, for showing up day after day and doing the job. The Luftwaffe sent him home temporarily to instruct at a Stuka training unit. He stopped on the way through Germany to get married, to Ursula Bergmann, nicknamed Hanne. He spent a brief period running the training unit, then pushed to return to the front. By November 1942, he was back. He completed his 600th mission. His fellow pilots, who had long since given up trying to get him to drink with them, Rudel didn't touch alcohol, didn't smoke, didn't do much of anything except train, fly, and sleep, reportedly celebrated the milestone by producing an enormous cake. Rudel ate the cake. Shortly afterward, he was admitted to hospital with a serious case of jaundice. Then he heard that his unit had been deployed to Stalingrad. He discharged himself. By the autumn of 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad had become something unlike anything the war had produced before. The city had been reduced to rubble, but the rubble itself had become the battlefield. Both sides fighting for individual buildings, individual floors of buildings, individual rooms. German and Soviet soldiers sometimes occupied different ends of the same structure simultaneously. Artillery was useless at that range. So was most air power, because the lines were so close and so tangled that a bomb dropped imprecisely could kill your own men as easily as the enemy's. The Stuka, paradoxically, was useful here precisely because it wasn't imprecise. The dive bombing technique Rudel had spent years mastering, low, steep, slow, accurate, meant the aircraft could be put to work in situations where no other bomber could operate. Rudel wrote later that in Stalingrad, the drops had to be accurate to avoid hitting German soldiers who were sometimes just yards away behind another wall. He described the experience as feeling more like Hades than Earth. He was flying 10 or more missions per day at this point, still jaundiced, still sick. The medical staff were furious. He kept flying. On February 10, 1943, Rudel completed his 1,001st combat mission. He became, at that moment, the first pilot in history to fly 1,000 combat sorties. The record had never existed before because nobody had ever come close to reaching it. Germany announced it nationally. He was a hero now, not just inside the Luftwaffe, but across the country. Propaganda reels featured his face. His name appeared in newspapers. Hitler awarded him the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross in person in Berlin in April 1943. Rudel went back to the front, but here is where the story changes shape. Because up to this point, for all its scale and intensity, what Rudel had been doing was essentially conventional. A dive bomber pilot flying a lot of missions against a lot of ground targets. Impressive. Unprecedented, but recognizable. What came next was different. What came next was the invention of something new. The Soviet Union's primary battle tank by 1943 was the T-34. It was a remarkable machine, well-armored, fast for its class, reliable enough to be produced in enormous numbers. The Germans had nothing to match it, tank for tank on the ground, and the T-34 was being manufactured in factories the Luftwaffe couldn't reach, in numbers the Wehrmacht couldn't keep up with. By the middle of the war, Soviet armored formations were appearing on the Eastern Front in concentrations that German ground forces simply couldn't handle alone. The Luftwaffe needed a way to kill tanks from the air. They had been experimenting with it. Different aircraft, different weapons, different approaches. None of it had produced results consistent enough to matter. After completing his 1,000th mission, Rudel was recalled to Germany and assigned to a new experimental anti-tank unit. The concept was to mount two 37mm Bordkanone BK 3.7 cannons, adapted directly from the standard Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun, in pods under the wings of a modified Stuka. 2 guns, 6 rounds each, 12 shots per pass. Tungsten core armor-piercing ammunition, capable of penetrating 58mm of steel plate at 100 meters. The aircraft was designated the Ju-87G. The crews called it the Kanonenvogel, the cannon bird. The aircraft had problems. Mounting 2 600-pound gun pods under the wings of a plane that was already considered slow and cumbersome made it even slower, even less agile, even more vulnerable to enemy fighters, anyone flying it low over an active armored. Formation was also flying within range of every rifle, machine gun, and anti-aircraft weapon on the ground. Rudel later wrote, with characteristic understatement, that the outlook was none too rosy. He flew it anyway. And in doing so, he figured something out that nobody else had worked out yet. A tank is not uniformly armored. The front and sides carry the heaviest plating. because that's where the designers expected most threats to come from. The rear, where the engine sits, is thinner. The roof is thinner still. A 37mm tungsten round fired from directly behind a tank, at low altitude, at close range, into the engine deck, would go straight through. Rudel's tactic was built on this. He came in low, sometimes just 15 meters above the ground, low enough to draw small arms fire, low enough that a crew with nerves of steel might hit him with a pistol. He approached from behind. He fired at close range, 100 to 150 meters, which meant by the time the tank crew heard the cannon his rounds were already hitting, and he pulled up before the wreckage below him had time to explode upward and reach his aircraft. He described it as uncomfortable on the occasions when a tank's ammunition store went up immediately beneath him. He described it that way without any apparent irony. The first major test came at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. The largest tank engagement in the history of warfare, two massive armored forces colliding across a huge salient in central Russia. Germany had assembled everything it had for one decisive offensive. The Soviet Union had built defensive lines 6 layers deep and waited for them. On July 5, 1943, the opening day of the German offensive, Rudel flew the Ju-87G into combat for the first time. The cannon bird had never been used operationally before. Only a handful of the aircraft existed. He flew it personally, with his own hands, into the largest armored battle in history. On July 12th, the 7th day of the offensive, the day the battle reached its peak around the town of Prokhorovka, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps faced a massive Soviet armored counterattack. Soviet tank brigades were moving across open ground toward the German lines. Rudel's squadron ranged ahead of the panzers, intercepting the columns. He flew 6 missions that day. By the end of it, he had destroyed 12 T-34 tanks in a single day. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 12 tanks, each one requiring a separate attack run, a separate approach, a separate pullout. 12 times he came in from behind, found the engine deck in his sights, fired, and climbed away from the explosion. Each kill was photographed by an onboard gun camera, so there was no dispute about the count. By October 1943, his cumulative tank total had reached 100. He was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of only 160 ever issued. The German position on the Eastern Front was deteriorating by this point. Stalingrad had already been lost. The attempt at Kursk had failed. The Soviets were now the ones advancing, and German forces were being pushed back across the vast territory they'd taken in 1941 and 1942. The retreat had begun. Rudel flew in that too. In fact, the retreat is where his record became genuinely extraordinary, because the role of his tank-killing Stukas shifted from supporting offensives to preventing catastrophes. Soviet armored columns were breaking through German defensive lines constantly. When that happened, the infantry on the ground had limited options. They called the Stukas. Rudel's unit became known among German ground troops as the Front Fire Brigade. Wherever the front was most on fire, wherever a Soviet tank column had broken through and was about to encircle something, wherever things were on the verge of collapsing, that's where the Immelmann wing was sent, and that's where Rudel was flying. German soldiers on the Eastern Front had an expression for certain periods of the retreat, the last 10 meters, the point at which whatever was coming, there was nowhere left to go. In the winter of 1943 and into 1944, Rudel's aircraft arrived at that last 10 meters over and over again and pushed it back. General Ferdinand Schörner, one of the senior German commanders on the Eastern Front, said it plainly in a military report, not dressed up in praise, not offered as rhetoric, stated as an operational assessment. Rudel alone replaces a whole division. A division. That's roughly 10,000 to 15,000 soldiers with full equipment, artillery, logistics, supply lines. One pilot in a modified, obsolete dive bomber was, according to one of his commanding generals, doing the work of all of that. By the end of 1943, His tank kill count stood at over 100. By early 1944, it was approaching 200. He had completed more than 1,500 missions. He had been shot down multiple times by anti-aircraft fire, never once by an enemy pilot, a distinction that would hold all the way to the end of the war. He had survived crash landings that would have killed most men. He hadn't taken a single period of leave. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He ran every morning when the conditions allowed it. He was 27 years old. The war was getting worse by the month for Germany. Every map in every headquarters in Berlin showed the lines moving in the wrong direction. The army that had stood on the outskirts of Moscow in 1941 was now fighting for territory that had been inside the Soviet Union when the war started. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and clear. The men at the top knew what was coming. Rudel apparently refused to see it, or if he saw it, he decided it was irrelevant. He just kept flying. In March 1944, something happened that had nothing to do with a tank or a target. Something that showed a different dimension of who he was. Something his commanding generals hadn't ordered and couldn't have predicted. It would cost him his gunner, and it would nearly cost him his life. By March 20th, 1944, somewhere over Ukraine, near the Dniester River, one of the aircraft in Rudel's formation takes a hit and goes down. The pilot gets out alive. He lands behind Soviet lines. For most squadron commanders in that situation, the protocol was clear. Note the position, report it, move on. The front was not a place where individual rescues were practical. The odds of landing a slow, unescorted Stuka in Soviet-held territory, loading up a downed pilot, and getting airborne again before enemy troops arrived were not good. Rudel had already done it at least 5 times before. He came down. He put his aircraft on the ground in Soviet-controlled territory, loaded the pilot, and tried to take off. But the wheels sank into soft mud. The Stuka wasn't going anywhere. Soviet troops were already moving toward them. What happened next across the following hours says more about this man than any combat record does. Rudel and his gunner, Erwin Henschel, who had flown at his side for 2.5 years across nearly 1,400 missions, abandoned the aircraft and moved on foot toward German lines. Several other crew members were with them. Soviet soldiers were in pursuit. There was a 100,000 ruble bounty on Rudel's head, dead or alive, placed there personally by Stalin, and the troops chasing him knew exactly who he was. They ran for miles through enemy territory in full flying gear. When they reached the Dniester River, it was in flood. Ice cold, 600 yards wide, running fast. There was no bridge, no choice. They stripped off their boots and flight suits and slid down the riverbank into the water. Rudel, the decathlete who had spent his whole life pushing his body past what it should be able to do, described the cold as becoming dead to all sensation. He went in last. He was the second man to reach the far bank. With 80 yards left to swim, Henschel threw up his arms and went under. Rudel dived back in. He couldn't find him. Henschel drowned in the Dniester. The man who had sat behind Rudel through 1,400 combat missions, who had been his rear gunner at Kronstadt, his eyes in the back of the aircraft, his second pair of hands in every dive, was gone. The other crew members who made the crossing were captured on the bank. Rudel was alone. He had been shot through the shoulder during the escape. He had no boots. He was soaking wet in near-freezing temperatures, deep inside Soviet-held territory, with enemy troops behind him and 100,000 rubles on his head. He walked 30 miles, mostly at night, guided by Romanian peasants who had no love for the Soviet occupation and shared what little food they had. His feet were so badly damaged by the time he reached German lines that he couldn't wear standard footwear for weeks. 9 days later, he appeared at Hitler's mountain retreat at the Berghof. He was there to receive the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. Germany's highest decoration at that time, one of only 27 ever awarded. He stood in the ceremony wearing his fur-lined flying boots. It was the only footwear his damaged feet could accommodate. He was back in the cockpit within the week. He destroyed 17 tanks in a single day. It is at this point in the story that Rudel starts to feel less like a military record and more like a recurring argument about what human limits actually are. Not because of the numbers, though the numbers are extraordinary, but because of the pattern. Every time something happens that should end him, it doesn't. Every time a wound, a crash, an illness, or a loss pushes him out of the fight, he finds a way back in. It raised a specific problem for the German High Command. By 1944, the war in the East had turned decisively. The German advance was over. The Soviets had absorbed the initial catastrophe of Barbarossa, rebuilt, rearmed with Allied material, and were now pushing the Wehrmacht back across the vast territory it had taken in 1941 and 1942. The front line had shifted hundreds of miles. German cities were being bombed around the clock by the Western Allies. The senior officers in Berlin understood, with increasing clarity, that the war was being lost. In this context, a man like Rudel had a value that went beyond anything he could destroy in the air. He was the most recognizable combat pilot in Germany. His face appeared in newsreels. His tank kill count was announced on national radio. Ordinary German soldiers on the Eastern Front, the men fighting in the mud and cold with inadequate supplies, and an enemy that kept coming regardless of what they did, heard his name as shorthand for something still fighting back. He was what the propaganda machine pointed to when it needed to demonstrate that the situation was not yet hopeless. Germany needed that image alive, and Germany could not afford for Rudel to fly himself to death. So they tried to stop him. In November 1944, Rudel was hit in the thigh near Budapest. The wound was serious enough to require surgery. He had the operation, received a plaster cast, and continued flying missions with his leg in the cast. The medical staff were, by this point in the war, apparently resigned to the fact that arguing with him was a waste of time. On December 22, 1944, Rudel flew his 2,400th combat mission. The following day, he was credited with his 463rd tank. He was 28 years old. He had been flying continuous combat operations for 3.5 years without meaningful rest, having never once taken a full period of leave of his own free will. Then came New Year's Day, 1945. The ceremony was held at the Western headquarters in the Taunus Hills. Present in the room alongside Rudel were Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The entire senior leadership of a Reich that was visibly falling apart, assembled to give one pilot a medal that had never been given to anyone before and would never be given to anyone after. The Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. It was originally conceived as a post-war award, 12 sets to be made, to be given to the greatest warriors of the Third Reich, once the final victory had been achieved. The final victory was not coming. The award was given anyway. Of the 6 sets manufactured, one was handed to Rudel. The remaining 5 were eventually captured by American forces at Schloss Klesheim. The medal contained 18-karat gold, 58 real diamonds, and 68 sapphires. Hitler also promoted him to Oberst, colonel, on that day. He was the youngest colonel in the Luftwaffe, and then Hitler told him to stop flying. Rudel had been here before. He knew the script. His position, each time this happened, was the same. He would not accept the decoration if accepting it meant being grounded. The exchange between the two men on January 1st, 1945 was not a long one. Hitler's face reportedly darkened. Then he relented. "All right," he said. "You may go on flying." What Hitler said to him before that, the assessment he offered of Rudel's standing among all the soldiers Germany had ever produced, has been recorded by multiple sources and doesn't appear to have been intended as rhetoric. Standing in front of his entire senior command on New Year's Day 1945, with the Reich crumbling on every front, Hitler told Rudel, "You are the greatest and most courageous soldier the German people have ever had." That is a significant statement for a man who had decorated hundreds of generals, dozens of field marshals, and a full roster of SS commanders who had spent the war winning battles and overseeing catastrophes in equal measure. And it was about a pilot who had never commanded an army, never led a campaign, and had spent the entire war in a two-man aircraft attacking things on the ground. Rudel went back to the front, but there's a part of this chapter that doesn't sit tidily alongside the UNFIT combat record, and it would be dishonest to skip past it. By 1944, the nature of the war Rudel was fighting had changed in ways that mattered to any serious account of his life. The Eastern Front was not simply a military campaign between two armies. It was a war of annihilation, deliberately and systematically so on the German side. The Holocaust was being carried out behind the front lines Rudel was flying over. Forced labor, mass shootings, the systematic murder of Jewish populations across occupied Soviet and Eastern European territory. All of it was happening on or near the ground he flew above every day. Rudel was never charged with a war crime. He was a combat pilot who flew attack missions against military targets, tanks, supply lines, artillery positions. There is no credible record of him targeting civilians. His fellow pilots described him as focused almost entirely on the flying, indifferent to most things outside the cockpit. But he knew what Germany was. He knew what the regime he served represented, and he never, at any point before or after the war, expressed anything other than support for it. That is not a small thing. It is a fact that belongs in the same account as the 519 tanks and the Dniester River and the ceremony on New Year's Day. How much weight to give it is something each person watching this has to decide for themselves. What is certain is that by the time Germany created a new decoration specifically for Rudel and ran out of medals to give him, the country was weeks from a military disaster that even the most dedicated officer could see coming. The men who understood strategy, men like Guderian, like Manstein, like Schörner himself, had been telling Hitler since 1943 that the war in the East could not be won. They were right, and they were ignored. Rudel seems to have occupied a different psychological space. He didn't appear to be in denial. He wasn't unaware of the tactical situation. He had eyes. He could read a map. In the final months of 1944, he told his own men plainly that he knew the war could no longer be won on two fronts, and yet he kept flying, every day, as if the act of flying, the act of fighting, had become something separate from the outcome, something that existed on its own terms regardless of what the strategic picture said. The German soldiers who called his unit the Front Fire Brigade weren't wrong in their assessment of what he did. Rudel's Stukas arrived at breakthroughs, stopped encirclements, held positions that would otherwise have folded. The tactical effect was real, but by late 1944, none of it changed the direction the war was moving. The Soviet Union was producing tanks in quantities that no number of kill counts could neutralize. The factories in the Urals that Germany had never been able to reach were turning out armor faster than Rudel could burn it. In November 1944, still flying with his leg in a plaster cast from the thigh wound, Rudel completed his second 1000th mission. Göring decorated him with the Golden Pilot's Medal with diamonds. He was awarded the front flying clasp in gold and diamonds, with a pendant showing the number 2000 in diamonds. A decoration so specific it could never be given to anyone else, even if they matched his record, because it counted the sorties numerically. They were running out of ways to recognize what he was doing. So they kept inventing new ones. Then came February 8th, 1945. Rudel still had his leg in a cast. The November thigh wound hadn't fully healed. The Oder River, the last major geographic obstacle between the Soviet army and Berlin, was the front line now. Soviet forces had established bridgeheads on the German side. The situation at the river was critical in the kind of way that meant, if it wasn't stopped, the capital itself would be next. Rudel flew 12 missions that day over the Oder. On each one he hit a tank, then a 13th, a heavy Stalin tank, one of the most armored vehicles the Soviets operated trying to cross the river. He used his last cannon round on it. His aircraft was hit almost simultaneously by a 40mm Soviet anti-aircraft shell. The round struck the cockpit. It hit his right leg, the same leg that had already been wounded in November, the one he had been flying on in a cast for 3 months. He called back to his gunner, Dr. Ernst Gatermann, the unit's doctor, who had taken the rear seat after Henschel's death, and who would eventually fly more than 850 combat missions himself in that position. "Ernst, my right leg is gone." Guiterman talked him down to a crash landing. He pulled Rudel from the wreckage. He applied a tourniquet and stopped the bleeding. Rudel lost consciousness. He woke up in a hospital with his right leg amputated below the knee. His physician looked him in the eye and told him what any reasonable person in that situation would say: "You are finished with flying." The hospital where Rudel woke up was near Seelow, east of Berlin. He came around on an operating table. His right leg was in a cast from the November thigh wound. His other leg, below the knee, was gone. For a moment, allow yourself to sit with what that actually means. This is a man who had just flown his 2,500th combat mission. A man who had been in the air almost every single day for 4 consecutive years, on the most brutal front in military history. A man who had been shot down 30 times by anti-aircraft fire, survived every crash, discharged himself from hospital multiple times mid-recovery, and refused every order to stop flying. He was 28 years old, and now he had one leg. Hitler's reaction, when he was informed of the amputation, was reported with characteristic coldness. He was lucky to get off so easy. Rudel's doctor looked him in the eye after the operation and gave his professional assessment. "You are finished with flying." There were flowers and letters from across Germany. The public had been following his record in the newsreels and the newspapers, and the news of his injury produced an outpouring of the kind of attention that wartime propaganda machines generate around their most useful symbols. He received them from a recovery bed in Berlin. He was back in the cockpit in 45 days. 45 days. That number deserves more than just acknowledgement. Because what it means in physical terms is this: Rudel did not wait for the stump to fully heal. He did not wait to be fitted with a proper prosthetic. He did not wait for clearance from any medical authority. He left the hospital with a partially healed wound, a temporary prosthesis that had been hastily constructed, and no medical sign-off. His mechanics faced a specific engineering problem. The Stuka's flight controls were foot-operated, the rudder pedals, the toe brakes, all of it required 2 functional feet. Without the right leg below the knee, Rudel couldn't operate the aircraft the way it was designed, so they modified it. They rigged a counterweight system on the rudder bar that allowed the stump to press against a projection rather than a standard pedal. They converted the foot-operated brake on the right side to a hand control. It was improvised. It was crude. And there was a specific, gruesome problem with it that emerged almost immediately. The rubbing of the projection against the partially healed stump reopened the wound. According to accounts from the men who flew with him in those final weeks, the cockpit of Rudel's aircraft was frequently stained with blood from his own leg. The mechanics cleaned it between missions. He got back in. He was carried to his aircraft by his ground crew because walking across the airfield on the prosthesis was too slow and too painful. They lifted him into the cockpit, strapped him in, and he flew. March 25, 1945. Rudel returned to operations. The war had roughly 6 weeks left. To understand what those 6 weeks looked like on the Eastern Front, you need to understand what had already happened by March 1945. The Soviet Union had launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in January, the largest single military operation of the war, and had driven the German front line back hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. By the time Rudel was back in the air, Soviet forces had already crossed the Oder River in multiple places and were within 40 miles of Berlin. Army Group Vistula, the formation tasked with defending the approaches to the German capital, had no realistic prospect of stopping what was coming. The men on the ground knew it. The commanders in the bunkers below Berlin knew it. Rudel flew in it regardless. In the weeks between March 25th and the end of the war, he destroyed 26 more tanks. The subsequent kills, according to a detail confirmed by the HistoryNet account of his final period, were officially attributed anonymously to the squadron rather than to Rudel personally. The reason for this was political and practical. Hitler had ordered Rudel grounded after the amputation, and the subsequent tank kills were happening against direct orders. Assigning them to Rudel by name would have made explicit the fact that he was flying in defiance of the Führer's instructions. So the kills went in the unit log. Rudel flew. The records showed the squadron's total rising. Nobody said whose hand was on the cannon. 26 tanks, after losing a leg, in the final weeks of a war that was already decided April 19, 1945. The day before Hitler's 56th birthday, Rudel was summoned to the Führer bunker in Berlin. The city was already encircled. Soviet artillery had been shelling the center for days. The streets above the bunker complex were rubble. The eastern suburbs were Soviet-held. The final assault on the city would begin the next morning. He went down into the bunker with one leg and an unhealed stump, and met the man who had called him the greatest and most courageous soldier the German people had ever produced. What the two men said to each other is recorded in Rudel's own account. By this point, he had stopped pretending. He told Hitler directly that the war could no longer be won on two fronts, that the only hope was an armistice with the Western Allies. He said it plainly, in the room beneath a burning city with Soviet shells audible above their heads. Hitler's response, as Rudel recorded it, was a tired one. He said he had been trying to negotiate a separate peace with the Western powers since 1943, that the Allies had demanded unconditional surrender from the start, that there was nothing to be done. The entire staff of the bunker lined up to say goodbye to Rudel when he left that night. He walked out past midnight with his prosthesis and his bleeding stump and flew back to his squadron. The man who had volunteered to fly a Stuka into a burning city to land on a street and pull Hitler out. That offer was reportedly made and reportedly refused. Hitler told him he was too valuable to lose on such a mission. He sent Rudel back to Bohemia instead. There's something in that exchange that sits uncomfortably alongside everything else in this story. Rudel had spent 4 years flying in service of a regime that was conducting industrialized murder across the territory he flew over every day. He had never wavered in his loyalty to it. He had rejected every order that conflicted with his desire to keep fighting. And here, in the final days, he offered to fly into the ruins of Berlin to save the man at the center of all of it, was turned down, and then walked out of the bunker in the middle of the night to go back to the only thing that had ever really defined him: getting back into an aircraft and fighting. You don't need to admire the cause to recognize the consistency. May 8th, 1945. Germany's unconditional surrender. The news reached Rudel at the airfield at Kummer in northern Bohemia. He called his officers together. He addressed the men of the Immelmann Wing, the unit he had flown with since the first day of Barbarossa in 1941, and thanked them for their bravery and their loyalty. Some accounts record that in the immediate aftermath of the surrender announcement, Rudel considered flying a suicide mission rather than surrendering. His men talked him out of it. What happened next was very deliberate. Rudel was not going to surrender to the Soviet Union. The 100,000 ruble bounty had long since been overtaken by events, but the Soviets' feelings about him had not moderated. He was the man who had destroyed the equivalent of 3 of their tank corps from the air. He was the man Stalin had personally wanted captured or killed. If Soviet forces took him, the best he could realistically expect was a show trial. The worst was considerably worse. He gathered what remained of his operational aircraft, 3 Ju-87 Stukas and 4 Focke-Wulf FW-19Os. He briefed his pilots. They would fly west, 2 hours, find American lines, surrender there. On the morning of May 8, 1945, the Immelmann Wing's final aircraft took off from Kummer and headed west. Rudel led them, one leg, unhealed stump, still flying. They found Kitzingen Airfield, southeast of Würzburg, held by the American 405th Fighter Group. When the German aircraft approached, the Americans scrambled their P-47 Thunderbolts to intercept. They had no way of knowing what these inbound aircraft intended. The Germans waggled their wings in the universal signal for surrender. The P-47s escorted them in. What Rudel did on landing is the kind of detail that tells you something about how he thought. Before climbing out of the cockpit, he ordered his pilots to collapse their own landing gear and lock their brakes on rollout. deliberately damaging the aircraft so the Americans couldn't use them, and blocking the airstrip with the wreckage in the process. He rendered his own aircraft useless as a final act of defiance, even in surrender. He then climbed down from the cockpit on one leg. The American executive officer who met them noticed the bloody stump immediately and offered Rudel a jeep to the medical station. Rudel declined. He insisted on walking through the American ranks on his prosthesis first. He limped past the formation of American soldiers, carrying himself upright, wearing what remained of his Knight's Cross decorations, and went to the aid station afterward. He told the American officers who debriefed him, in English, that he was the most highly decorated German soldier of the war. He passed his Knight's Cross around the room for the officers to examine. He described his record: the 519 tanks, the battleship, the 2,530 missions, in the flat, factual tone of a man reporting figures he had simply observed. No performance, no emotion. The Americans were, by all accounts, not sure what to do with him. Rudel was held in American camps for 11 months, first in England, then France. He received inadequate medical care for his amputation wound, to the point where he had to petition repeatedly for transfer to a German military hospital before proper treatment was provided. He was released in April 1946. He was 29 years old. He had one leg. He had no country. The Germany he had served no longer existed. And he was free. The war Rudel had fought from the first morning of Barbarossa to the final flight to Kitzingen had been, by any military measure, a loss. Everything he had done, every tank, every mission, every wound, every refusal to stop, it had not changed the outcome by one day. What it had produced was a record so extreme it defined categories that hadn't existed before and haven't been approached since. Most combat missions by any pilot in history, most armored vehicles destroyed from the air by any pilot, ever. The only recipient of a decoration that was created specifically because no existing decoration was adequate, and a stump that was still bleeding when he walked past the American formation at Kitzingen. What Rudel did with the 37 years he had left, and what it means that the most lethal combat pilot of the war turned out to be the man he became after it. That is where the story goes next. On June 8, 1948, Buenos Aires. A man named Emilio Meyer stepped off a flight from Rome. His papers were Red Cross documents, issued with the help of an Austrian bishop named Alois Rudel, who had been facilitating the departure of Nazi fugitives from Europe since 1945. The name on the passport was false. The man behind it was the most decorated soldier in German military history. Hans-Ulrich Rudel had one leg, a fake identity, and no country. The Germany he'd served no longer existed. It had been divided, occupied, and rebuilt under the supervision of the very powers he had spent 4 years trying to kill from the air. The Luftwaffe was disbanded. The Immelmann wing was gone. The airfields were rubble. The cause he'd never stopped believing in had ended in total catastrophe. He rented a house in Villa Carlos Paz, a small city in Córdoba province, about 35 kilometers from the regional capital. He ran a brickworks. He wrote his memoir, titled in German Trotzdem, Nevertheless, published in Buenos Aires in 1949. The book supported the Nazi regime, attacked the German officers who hadn't fought hard enough for Hitler, and described the invasion of the Soviet Union as a defensive war. The West German government debated whether to allow it to be published there, given that the author was a known, declared, and entirely unrepentant National Socialist. They allowed it. It sold well. Rudel's life in Argentina was not obscure. He became a close friend and confidant of Juan Perón, the president, who was building his own authoritarian nationalist state and had opened Argentina's doors to somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000 Nazi fugitives by the time the flow slowed. Rudel helped train Perón's Air Force. With Perón's political backing, he secured lucrative military contracts with Brazil. He founded an organization called the Kameradenwerk, roughly translated as the Comrades Network, which functioned as a rat line, a funding and logistics operation that helped wanted Nazi war criminals escape Europe to South America and the Middle East, paid legal fees for those imprisoned in European jails, and sent food parcels to Rudolf Hess and Karl Donitz while they were serving their Nuremberg sentences. And during his time in Argentina, Rudel met Josef Mengele. Mengele was the SS doctor who had performed medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, selecting who would die, subjecting others to experiments that had no medical purpose and left survivors permanently damaged. He was wanted for crimes against humanity and had been hiding in South America since 1949. Rudel knew who he was. Rudel, along with a former Waffen-SS correspondent named Willem Sassen, who worked initially as his driver, helped relocate Mengele to Brazil by connecting him with a Nazi sympathizer named Wolfgang Gerhard. In 1957, Rudel and Mengele traveled together to Chile to meet Walter Rauff, the man who had designed Germany's mobile gas chambers. Mengele reportedly found Rudel's politics too extreme, even by his own standards. He later complained about what he called the stupid anti-Nazi material being pushed on young Germans since 1945, contrasting it unfavorably with what Rudel actually said and believed. Rudel's position was apparently so far to the right that it made Mengele uncomfortable. That is a sentence that needs no commentary. The CIA placed Rudel under observation. The files compiled on him described his activities in arms dealing and military advising across multiple South American regimes: Perón in Argentina, Pinochet in Chile, Stroessner in Paraguay. When Perón's government was overthrown by military coup in 1955, Rudel moved to Paraguay and continued his work as a foreign representative for German companies, including Siemens, Focke-Wulf, Messerschmitt, and Dornier. He was apparently quite good at it. Here is where the story produces its most uncomfortable contradiction. The same physical constitution that had allowed Rudel to fly 2,530 combat missions, survive 30 crash landings, take 5 serious wounds, and return to combat 6 weeks after an amputation. That same body, in peacetime, refused to become sedentary. On one leg and a prosthesis, Rudel competed in tennis tournaments in Argentina. He skied. In 1951, he nearly reached the summit of Aconcagua, the highest peak in the Americas at 6,962 meters, nearly 23,000 feet above sea level. He ascended a major Andean volcano 3 times. He wrote a book about his mountaineering adventures. A man who had been carried to his aircraft because he couldn't walk the length of an airfield on his stump was, within a few years, climbing the Andes. It's the kind of detail that makes the whole story harder to hold comfortably, because if the qualities that produce those climbs, the stubbornness, the refusal to accept physical limits, the conviction that only he who gives up on himself is lost, are the same qualities that produce the 519 tanks, and the Marat, and the Dniester River, and the return after the amputation, then the person and the record are not separable. You can't take the will that built one and leave behind the will that powered the other. They came from the same place. Rudel returned to West Germany in 1953. He joined the German Reich Party, the DRP, a far-right nationalist party with neo-Nazi alignment. And in the 1953 federal election, he stood as its top candidate. He was not elected. He remained in German public life, an increasingly controversial figure, representing a set of beliefs that post-war Germany was legally and culturally trying to put behind it, and making no effort whatsoever to pretend otherwise. In 1976, his presence at a reunion of former Immelmann Wing veterans, held on Maim Bundeswehr Air Base, which required military authorization, triggered what became known in Germany as the Rudel scandal. The Secretary of State at the Defense Ministry had explicitly forbidden the event from being held on military premises because of Rudel's association with a neo-Nazi party. 2 senior generals, General Lieutenant Walter Krupinski and the Inspector of the Air Force Gerhard Limburg, overruled the ban and allowed it to proceed anyway. When this became public, the defense minister ordered both generals into early retirement. The scandal was significant enough to prompt a full debate in the West German Bundestag in February 1977, and ultimately led to new guidelines on military tradition and the limits of how the Bundeswehr could honor its wartime predecessors. Rudel's name was at the center of that national debate. His response was to carry on as before. Now the part of the story that sits on the other side of all of this, the part that American military planners in the middle of the Cold War found useful enough to act on. By the late 1960s, the United States Air Force was developing a new close air support aircraft, a dedicated ground attack plane designed specifically to destroy Soviet tanks if the Cold War ever turned hot over the German plain. The program was called the AX project. What came out of it became the A-10 Thunderbolt II, which American ground troops would eventually nickname the Warthog, and which would destroy more than 900 Iraqi tanks in the Gulf War and continue flying close support missions for American forces for decades. Pierre Sprey was one of the key engineers and procurement officials who designed it. When he was asked later about the intellectual foundations of the A-10 project, he was specific. He said the combat experience of World War II ground attack pilots was directly relevant to everything the A-10 needed to do. The tactics, the cannon effectiveness, the sortie rates from rough forward fields, the coordination with ground troops, and he made one thing mandatory for everyone on his design team. They had to read Rudel's memoir, Stuka Pilot. Spray's reasoning was direct. Rudel was, in his words, the expert on killing Soviet tanks. 519 of them. But more than that, Rudel was brilliant on tactics, on training, on command and control, on squadron leadership. The decision to make the A-10's primary weapon a 30mm rotary cannon firing depleted uranium rounds capable of penetrating tank armor from the air was influenced in part by the operational lessons Rudel had worked out by trial and error over the Eastern Front between 1943 and 1945. Rudel was also invited to Washington. The 30mm gun program manager, Colonel Robert Dilger, brought him in to lead a symposium attended by several hundred American engineers, analysts, tacticians, and intelligence officers. Sprey translated for him, as Rudel spoke almost no English. He stood in a room in the American capital, the Wu, most decorated pilot Germany had ever produced with one leg, and explained to American military planners how to destroy Soviet armor from the air. The Cold War had produced stranger ironies, but not many. The A-10 that emerged from that process has, in the decades since, killed more tanks than any other aircraft in the world. In the Gulf War alone, it destroyed more armored vehicles than Rudel did in 4 years of combat on the Eastern Front. It is the direct institutional descendant of the Kanonenvogel, the cannon bird, the slow, ugly aircraft that Rudel flew at 15 meters above the ground into the engine decks of T-34s. He lived to see it fly. He died in Rosenheim, West Germany on December 18, 1982, from a stroke. He was 66 years old. The funeral was in Dornhausen 4 days later. The Bundeswehr had formally forbidden its soldiers to attend in uniform. Many came in uniform anyway. Thousands of people showed up. Men who had served with him, men who had read about him, men and women and children who had grown up in a Germany that had been told to forget soldiers like Rudel and found they couldn't quite manage it. 4 mourners were photographed giving Nazi salutes at the graveside. They were investigated under German law banning the public display of Nazi symbols. During the burial, 2 West German Air Force F-4 Phantoms flew low over the cemetery. The Bundeswehr's official position was that Dornhausen was situated along a regular military flight path, and the overflight was coincidental. Nobody who was there appeared to believe that. So, what do you do with all of this? During World War II, roughly 90% of the German population tried to continue living as normally as possible under the conditions of a wartime state. Another portion collaborated with the regime, with the occupation policies, with the machinery of the war. A small percentage fought in the armed forces or in the resistance or in the underground. Of those who fought in the armed forces, an infinitesimally small number produced records that reached the level of Rudel's. 2,530 missions, 519 tanks, 1 battleship, shot down 30 times and never once by an enemy pilot, 5 serious wounds, 1 amputation, 45 days from losing a leg to getting back in the cockpit, 26 tanks after that. Those numbers are real. They are documented by the Luftwaffe's own records, confirmed by gun camera footage, witnessed by fellow pilots in enough instances that the official tally can't be dismissed as fabrication. They represent something that happened, something a human being did with his body and his mind over 4 years of sustained combat at the most intense intensity level the war produced on any front. And the man who produced them was also a dedicated Nazi who never recanted, who helped wanted war criminals escape justice, who sheltered and assisted Josef Mengele, who spent the remaining 37 years of his life advocating for a movement that had overseen the systematic murder of millions of people. He knew what the regime was. He served it willingly. He defended it openly until the last day of his life. These two things are both true about the same person. They don't resolve each other. They don't cancel each other out. The combat record doesn't excuse the ideology. The ideology doesn't erase the record. Holding them in the same frame, without collapsing one into the other, is the only honest way to look at Hans-Ulrich Rudel. General Schörner said he alone was worth a division. Pierre Sprey required his book to be read by every engineer designing America's most lethal tank-killing aircraft. The CIA watched his movements across 3 continents. The West German Bundestag debated his name. 2 phantoms flew over his grave. He was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary combat pilots in the history of warfare. He was also, by his own repeated and lifelong admission, an unrepentant supporter of one of the most destructive ideologies the modern world has produced. The man who was declared unsuitable for combat flying at 22, who was told he was finished with flying at 28 after losing his leg, who crossed 30 miles of enemy territory on foot with a bullet in his shoulder and no boots in March 1944. That man's personal motto never changed from the day his sisters teased him out of his childhood timidity in a village in Silesia to the day he was buried in Dornhausen in 1982. Only he who gives up on himself is lost. He never gave up on himself. That much is beyond dispute. Whether what he refused to give up on was worth fighting for is a different question entirely, and one he answered clearly, consistently, and without apology for the rest of his life.